She was a bride by force, but the human made her eyes shine again. HFY love story. She didn't even look at the alien warlord she was being forced to marry, her hands trembling as the chains of death locked around her wrists, tighter than any vow ever could. Her eyes were dull like a prisoner walking to her final cell, but then a voice rose from the crowd, calm and defiant, a human voice that said, "Let her choose." And when she looked up and saw him, really saw him, her eyes didn't just shine, they ignited. And in that moment, something ancient in the room shattered. They said the debt was old and unpayable, and written in blood across the stars. A pact made before she was born, when her father stood before the council of the Dravari proud aliens. With scales like cracked glass and eyes like heatless suns, begging for aid to save their dying colony ship, and in return, he promised them his firstborn daughter to be wed to their warrior prince when the time came, and now the time had come. And she stood in the ceremonial hall, dressed not in white but in dull gray robes that smelled like dust and chains, her long silver hair woven with ceremonial thorns, and her eyes downcast like a candle burning out, and the hall was full of cold. Witnesses, ambassadors, merchants, debt-keepers, and silent guards with stunned staves, who watched not with sympathy but with boredom, because this was tradition. This was legality, this was justice, and beside her stood Lord Theric, tall, armored, fangs polished, with gold paint, and his voice booming as he spoke the binding words in his tongue, and each word tightened the bond like invisible wires around her soul, and she said nothing because she had no say, and her mother cried quietly behind her veil, and her father sat frozen as if made of stone. And when the final word came, the hall grew still, waiting for her to echo it, to seal the vow. But before she could, a voice rose from the back, not loud but sharp, slicing through the silence like a beam through ice, and all turned and saw a human standing alone, out of place. A traitor, or maybe a wanderer, his clothes simple, his eyes fierce, and his voice stronger this time, as he said, "Let her choose," and it was as if no one had ever considered such a thing before. The hall recoiled, the priests muttered, the guards tensed, and Theric growled. But she lifted her head for the first time since entering, and met the human's gaze, and something in her cracked open, because no one had ever spoken. For her, no one had ever said she had a choice, and she saw in him not just defiance but sorrow and fire. And for a moment, it was like remembering the feeling of sunlight after endless rain, and the head priest bellowed that the ceremony was sacred, and interruption was punishable by death. And the human stepped forward again, slowly, boldly, and said, "Then kill me, but let her speak." And the guards raised their weapons, and Theric snarled, but the princess, now trembling from something, knew not fear, but hope, whispered, "Wait." And the hall paused, frozen by that word, because it came from her, and she had never spoken out of turn before. And even her father blinked, as if seeing her for the first time, and she looked at Theric and said, "I will not say the vow, not yet." And he bared his fangs and called her ungrateful, and swore that a promise broken would mean blood and ruin. And the human turned to him and said, "Then fight me for her." And the hall erupted, because such a challenge hadn't been spoken in 100 years. And the priests wailed, and the merchants backed away, and the guards didn't know whom to obey, and Kosh didn't know 100 years. Theric laughed deep and low and said, "You're no warrior, you're no noble." And the human said, "I'm human, and that's enough." And suddenly the silence returned, heavier than before, because everyone knew what humans were, what they could do, not just in war but in will. And the princess looked at him again, her heart pounding, and something inside her aching to move, to run, to scream. And for the first time since she was 5, she felt alive. And Theric accepted the challenge, his claws flexing, his armor hissing. And the duel was set not for the hall, but for the courtyard beneath the 3 moons where blood could be spilled without violating the sacred walls. And as they led the human out, the princess caught his sleeve just for a second, and he turned and she whispered, "Why?" And he said, "Because you looked at me like you wanted to be free, and I couldn't forget that." And then he was gone, and the courtyard filled, and the arena was lit, and the princess stood at the balcony above watching, unable to breathe, as Theric stalked into the circle, blade in hand, a weapon made of compressed void steel, and the human entered empty-handed, but calm, his eyes never leaving hers, as if drawing strength from just one glance. And then the horn sounded, and the fight began, and it was not fair, not even close. Theric moved like a storm, his blade carving air with deadly speed, and the human ducked, rolled, jumped out, attacking, just surviving, and for minutes it was all dodging and pain and blood, and everyone started laughing, mocking the challenge, mocking the hope, and the princess clutched the rail, her nails digging into stone, and then the human grabbed a broken pole from the arena edge, snapped it clean, and charged not with strength, but with purpose, and he struck not the body, but the joints, the armor gaps, the places where instinct failed, and he moved like someone who had learned to fight not in duels, but in desperate alleys and burning trenches, and inch by inch he drove Theric back until the warlord roared and swung wildly, and the human ducked and drove the blunt wood into his side, and something cracked, and the warlord fell, not dead, but broken and gasping, and the horns blew again, and the hall was silent, not in honor but in disbelief, and the priest stammered, and the guards didn't move, and the human turned to her and said, "Now you choose." And everything in her heart screamed, "Run, take his hand, flee from this world," but her feet stayed rooted, because even freedom was terrifying when you've lived your whole life in chains. And yet her eyes now shone bright, not with fear but with something new, and when she stepped forward and said, "I choose him," the world did not end, but it did change, and everyone watching felt it. The air after her choice was so heavy, it felt like even the stars outside the palace had paused to watch, and as she stepped down from the ceremonial platform, the silence felt louder than any war drum, and the human stood there, bloodied, bruised, and breathing like every step he took cost him a memory. But when she reached him and touched his arm, something in him steadied, and she looked up into his eyes and said, "Thank you," and he whispered, "You gave me the strength to fight," and she wanted to ask how or why, or even who he truly was, because no human should have even been in that hall, let alone stand alone against a warlord. But before she could, the guards surged forward, not in rage, but in confusion, because tradition had been broken. And the priests shouted blasphemy, and the merchant lords began muttering about the debt still unpaid, and her father stood up finally, his voice thunderous, as he said, the vow was undone, and the pact would be rewritten, and that he would find another way. But no one listened, because Theric had risen, limping, his armor cracked, his pride shattered, his blade gone, but his fury undimmed, and he screamed that the human had cheated, that the challenge had been false, and demanded trial by the elders. And the human looked up at him and said again, "Then let her choose before them, and if she speaks your name, I will walk away." And everyone froze again, because a vow spoken before the elders was ancient law, and Theric hesitated, because deep inside his broken rage he knew what she would say. And the princess, now shaking, stepped closer to the circle, where blood still stained the stone, and said, "I will speak before them." And the hall emptied as words spread faster than light, and the elders were summoned, ancient beings, some Dravari, some from other allied races who had no care for politics, only for the balance of oaths and old laws, and the council chamber glowed with their presence, and the princess stood at the center between the human And Theric, her heart a storm, her voice a flicker, and she was asked, plainly, who do you choose? And she looked at the human, then at the warlord, then back again, and said, I choose the one who asked me to choose. And the elders nodded, for law had been served, and in that moment, something unspoken passed between her and the human, something deeper than thanks, something that felt like beginning. But just as the court turned to end the matter, a merchant voice, cold and sharp, declared that the debt was still alive and could not vanish with the duel, and that the human would now bear it for stealing the bride. And she turned furious, and said, I am not stolen. I chose, but they ignored her, as if her voice had become wind again, and the human stepped forward, and said, then I will bear it. And she gasped, because he had no idea what that meant, and the merchant smiled wide, because it was not just money or titles or land, it was servitude across systems, a lifetime of work contracts, silence laws, and isolation. And she turned to him pleading, don't. But he only said, I cannot watch you be a prisoner again. And in one word he erased the chains from her, and fastened them to himself, and the court stamped it into record binding and ancient. The guards took him not with violence, but with cold routine, and he looked at her one last time before the door shut between them and whispered, live free, and then he was gone, dragged into the bureaucracy of alien debt law, and she was left standing there with the cold crown of freedom heavy on her head. And that night her bed felt larger and colder than it ever had, and her chest ached like something had been carved out. And she did not sleep. She wandered the halls of the palace, alone, unguarded, for the first time in years, and when she looked at the stars, she wondered where he was, if he was allowed to sleep, if they fed him or just used him. And she made a decision then, not from fear or love or rebellion, but from something deeper, a fire that had been lit the moment he spoke for her, and refused to let it burn out. And she summoned her father in the morning, and said, teach me the laws. And he laughed bitterly, until he saw her eyes and realized she meant it. And for weeks she studied, not the way nobles do, but the way soldiers study maps and spies. Study doors, she learned contracts, trade treaties, bond laws, and found every thread of the debt chain, and traced it until her head ached and her hands trembled. And every night she dreamed of him bent and bleeding in some cold workstation, because she still didn't even know his name. No one had asked him. No one had recorded it. He had become a line on a record, a slave by sacrifice, and her heart screamed against it. And she found allies among the silence. She spoke to the lower lords, the ignored council members, the outcasts, the record keepers, and slowly, piece by piece, she uncovered the truth that the original debt had been fulfilled decades ago, that interest had been falsely added, that her marriage had been a political tool, not a repayment. And she gathered it all into a record and walked back into the council chamber, not as a daughter or a bride, but as a fire wrapped in flesh, and demanded trial, not for the human, but for the ones who used her as a coin. And the elders again were summoned, and the evidence presented. And when it was over, silence reigned, and the law ruled that the debt was null and void, and always had been, and the marriage claim was erased from record, and the merchants fined, and the warlord shamed. And yet she did not smile, not yet, not until she asked, where is he? And they said he had been sent to the mines of Lither for the deepest and darkest of the work colonies. And she said, send me. And they refused. And she said, I am a free citizen and heir, and I demand transport. And so they allowed it, but gave no escort, no promise of aid. And so she traveled alone across space, riding freighters, bribing pilots, crossing borders, and finally, after weeks, she landed on Lither 4, a world choked in ash and fire and silence. And she walked through the gates with no weapon, only the fire in her blood. And when the guards stopped her, she held out the decree signed by the elders declaring him free, and demanded to see the human. They brought him, barely conscious, thinner dirt-streaked fingers like bones and eyes dull. But when he saw her, he smiled faintly and said, "I knew you'd come," and she dropped the paper and ran to him and caught him as he fell and whispered, "You're free," and he said, "Only if you are." And in that moment, the stars above them felt like witnesses. The ship that brought them back was old and slow and creaked with every jump like it too had borne the weight of silence and suffering, and yet inside its dim metal walls something soft and powerful was blooming, because he lay in the medical bay. Still weak, still shaking from weeks of labor and starvation, but his eyes never left her, not even when he slept, and she sat by his side reading to him old stories from his world translated badly into Galactic common, but still enough to make him smile. And she didn't care that the bed was too small, or that the light flickered, or that the engines hummed like a dying beast, because all that mattered was that he was beside her and breathing, and every day he grew a little stronger, and every day she learned a little more about him, how he'd come from a fringe colony, how he'd wandered not for glory or adventure, but to escape something unspoken, how he never wanted to be a hero, and yet when he saw injustice, he could not look away. And she listened to every word like they were treasures hoarded from lifetimes, and sometimes he would reach out weakly, and she would take his hand, and they wouldn't speak because the silence between them was more sacred than any vow. And when the ship finally reached orbit above her homeworld again, she looked down not with dread or chains, but with something fierce, because now she was returning not as a daughter traded or a pawn moved, but as a voice that would no longer stay quiet. And as they descended, the council was already waiting, because word had spread not just of the debt broken, but of the heir who had challenged tradition and gone alone to the mines and returned with the one they tried to bury. And they couldn't silence it anymore, because the people were whispering, the servants, the guards, the children in the streets. They whispered of her, and of him, and of how she chose not once, but twice. And as the ramp lowered and she stepped out with him leaning on her shoulder, not like a burden, but like a partner, the crowd was silent for a moment, too stunned to speak, and then a single voice called out her name, and then another, and then a roar of cheers that shook the air, and she held him tighter, because fame was not safety, and applause was not protection. And the council approached with forced smiles and careful words, and offered him citizenship and compensation and a clean record, and she watched his face and saw the weariness there, the caution. And she spoke for him, saying, "Thank you, but he will speak for himself now." And he did, slowly but clearly, saying, "I want none of your coins or praise, just my life back and maybe a quiet place to heal." And they promised it and gave him a residence in the Sky District, where the towers shimmered like glass knives and the air was clean and still, and she visited every day, bringing him stories and laughter, and sometimes just silence. And one night, as the moons hung low and the stars blinked slow, she stood at his window looking out, and he asked, "Do you regret it?" And she turned to him, eyes glowing, and said only that, "I didn't say no sooner." And he smiled, not with his lips, but with something deep and quiet and whole, and reached for her hand, and this time she didn't hesitate, and they stood there like that two pieces that were never meant to fit, but did anyway. And yet the peace didn't last, because somewhere far across the void Theric was not silent. He had vanished from the court, gone into exile, but not defeat, and the whispers said he was gathering those who believed in the old ways, those who saw her choice as weakness and betrayal, and they called her names behind closed doors: Oathbreaker, Debt Which Human Touched. And the threats began quiet, at first a symbol scratched on her door, a message pulsing on a data screen, and she ignored them. But the human did not, because he knew the price of letting shadows grow, and so he trained even as he healed, not with weapons, but with awareness, with quiet paths and silent steps. And one night he stopped a blade meant for her from behind, and when the guards arrived, he said nothing, just handed them the would-be assassin, and she looked at him, eyes wide and full of fear. Not for herself, but for him, and he said, "I will not lose you after everything, not now." And she held his face and said, "Then stay close, because I am not going to run." And so he moved into the palace, not as a guest or a guard, but something in between. And every night they sat together on the highest balcony, speaking softly of dreams and scars and futures, and the people began to see not just a scandal, but a story. Something old reborn in new fire, and some of the younger lords came to her quietly, asking how she did it, how she stood up and didn't break, and she told them the truth. "I saw someone do it first, and I refused to let the world stay the same." And slowly change came, not in laws or banners, but in eyes, in the way people looked at their daughters, at their sons, at their choices. And still the danger brewed, because Theric had all eyes off-world, and they sent envoys wrapped in peace but laced with venom, and the council begged her to step back, to return to silence, to let things cool. But she said no again, and this time when they pushed harder, the human stood beside her and said, "She is not alone, and we will not go quietly." And that night as they stood by the window, the sky flared with a light not natural, a warning of something coming. And he looked at her and said, "Then let them come." And she nodded, heart pounding, because she knew this was no longer just about love or law. This was about the future they were building, one whisper, one scar, one promise at a time. The night the sky burned was the night their peace truly died, because the ships that entered orbit were not official, not flagged, not hailed. They simply came like wolves in silence, and no warning bells rang until the first blast hit the outer skyport, and the tower crumbled like sand, and panic rose across the city like a wave as citizens ran and guards scrambled, and communication lines fried with electromagnetic surges. And at the heart of it all stood the princess, now fully cloaked in duty and fire, not asking who would help, but commanding what must be done. And beside her, the human moved not as a shadow, but as a force, watching her six, checking every corridor, carrying no rank, yet obeyed by all who saw his eyes, because they held the weight of someone who had already died once, and come back not for revenge, but for someone worth standing for. And when the reports came that Therac's mercenaries had landed in disguise weeks ago, waiting for this moment, she didn't flinch. She only asked how many and where, and then said, "We hold the palace and buy time for the evacuation." And the council argued and panicked and shouted until the human slammed his hand on the war table and said, "She speaks, you listen." And silence fell, because even the oldest lords knew there was something in his voice that made you obey, even if you didn't understand why. And the palace was sealed, gates locked, blast shields down, and the royal guard lined the halls, while civilians streamed through the tunnels beneath the city. And above them the enemy closed in, not as an army, but as vipers, groups of 4 or 5 slipping through alleys, blowing up checkpoints, disabling defenses, and one by one sectors went dark. But the palace held, because she was in the command room calling shots, tracking movements, and for the first time they weren't fighting for her, but with her. And the human moved like wind, putting out fires, saving guards, pulling the wounded to cover. And when he returned to her side, covered in soot and blood, she looked at him not with fear, but with fierce pride, and said, "I'm glad you didn't run." And he said, "I'd follow you even here." And they didn't speak of love, because there was no time, only war. And on the third day the enemy reached the inner halls, breaching through the north gate with plasma charges, and the real battle began. Screams and metal and fire, and in the heart of it all she stood, armor on, sword drawn, not ceremonial, but earned, and fought beside her people, cutting down enemies who once called her theirs. And the human fought not with honor, but with instinct protecting her back, catching every blind spot, breaking through walls when needed, and when the throne room was breached. And Theric himself entered flanked by brutes and traitors. He paused, seeing her standing there, not afraid, not broken, and said, "You were never meant for war," and she said, "I was never meant for chains," and then they clashed, and the throne room became a graveyard of stone and ash, and during the fight she was wounded, a cut across her ribs that bled like fire, but she kept going, and the human saw her fall, and something in him snapped, and he tore through the enemy like a storm breaking Therac's blade with his bare hands and driving him to the floor, and when he raised his weapon, Theric laughed and said, "Go ahead, prove them right," and the human said, "I don't need to," and dropped the blade and turned away, because mercy was power too, and the guards came and bound Theric, and the surviving attackers surrendered, and it was over not with cheers, but with silence and smoke, and when she collapsed he caught her, and held her against his chest, whispering, "Stay with me," and she smiled faintly, and said, "I'm not leaving you again," and they carried her to the medbay where surgeons worked in silence, and he waited, outside, hands trembling, blood still drying on his face, and when they finally said she would live, he sank to his knees because it was the first time in days he let himself feel, and when she woke she found him asleep by her bed, still holding her hand, and she didn't wake him because that moment was more sacred than any vow, and when he did stir hours later and saw her awake, he only smiled and said, "I knew you'd come back," and she whispered, "Always," and they were quiet for a long time because the city still smoked and the dead still counted, but inside the room there was peace, and she said, "When I'm strong again, we rebuild," and he said, "We build something new, not just repaired, but right," and she nodded and said, "Together," and in the weeks that followed the city rose slower but stronger, and the council stepped back, allowing new voices to rise, and she sat in the chambers not as a pawn but a storm, and the human walked the halls not as a servant but as a symbol, and the people whispered still, but now they whispered with hope, and even the children began to play games where princesses saved themselves, and humans stood beside them, and though danger was not gone and scars still ached, the palace was no longer a prison, it was home. And one night as the stars spun slow and the air was calm, she took his hand and said, "Do you still think I shine?" And he laughed gently and said, "You're blinding," and then he kissed her, not like a claim or a rescue, but like someone who knew exactly who she was and how far she'd come, and she kissed him back because love had waited long enough. Peace was never silent, it just changed its shape, and now as the fires were out and the ashes swept away, and the palace repaired with metal and vines growing in fresh carved cracks, the real war began, not with guns or swords, but with eyes and whispers, and council chambers filled with cold smiles and warmer threats, because while the people loved her and the human stood like a symbol made flesh, there were those in the deeper currents of power who could not stand the idea of a princess and a man from Earth reshaping what had been set for centuries, and they began moving slowly, carefully, offering her allies secret deals, offering him safe passage away from court, as if trying to peel them apart like soft stone, and though she never showed it in her steps or voice, she felt it every hour, the pressure, the doubt, the way even praise was laced with poison, and still she stood tall every day in the high chamber, answering to those who once gave orders and now could only raise objections. And still he walked with her, his hand close to his side, not touching, but always ready, and the bond between them did not break, but it changed, it deepened, it ached, because love forged in fire must still survive the cold, and some nights they barely spoke, just looked at each other across the quiet of their rooms, knowing words couldn't always hold the weight they carried, and yet each morning they woke and chose again to keep going, to keep building, and when the Alliance worlds sent envoys, some in robes, some in armor, each one with questions veiled as compliments, they greeted them not as lovers, but as leaders, and still the questions came. How long will this last? How can a human rule beside her? What of heirs and bloodlines and treaties? And she smiled and said, I will decide my legacy. And he simply said, we're not here to follow your blueprint. And when an envoy from a warrior caste tried to insult him in open court, calling him a pet, the silence that followed was brutal and sharp. And before anyone else could respond, the princess said gently, the last man who called him, that is now serving life in the outer void, want to join him? And the court didn't laugh, but they understood, and even the human turned to her later and said, you didn't have to, and she said, I always will, and they sat in that strength, not alone, but watched by those waiting for a crack. And then the visions began, or maybe they were dreams, or maybe something more ancient the palace seers brought. Warnings of a rift growing not in the stars, but in the soul of the city. Something that would break if not faced, and the human said, let it come, because we've already faced worse. And the princess wasn't so sure, because while enemies could be fought, shadows inside the heart were harder, and she began to feel it too, the weight of legacy. The guilt of all the lives lost to buy their freedom, the children, who now whispered their names like myths and asked for stories of how it began, and she didn't know what to say, not really, because how do you explain that freedom doesn't feel like flying, but like falling with your eyes open? And the human saw it in her face, in the way she touched the old stone of her mother's garden, or lingered in the chambers where she once knelt in silence. And he came to her one night and said, you don't have to carry it all. And she said, I do. And he said, then let me carry you. And she cried for the first time since that day in the hall, not loudly, not broken, but quietly, like a wall crumbling at the edges. And he held her, saying nothing, because some wounds heal only when you're not forced to name them. And after that night, something changed, not in them, but around them. People began to see not just the fire, but the cost, and began to understand that strength wasn't in the sword or the speech, but in the days after the war, when you choose to stay. And she stood in court the next day with no crown, no makeup, just a robe and truth, and said, we are not returning to the old ways. We are not building thrones on bones. And if that costs me your favor, so be it. And half the court walked out, but the half that remained stood with her. And when she looked to her right, the human was there, not standing in front, not behind, but beside her. And that night, as they walked the palace halls, the stars above blinking slowly, she said, do you regret it? And he said, only that I waited so long to find you. And they kissed under the vines of the oldest tree, and didn't let go for a long time, because the war wasn't over. But for now, their hearts had found ground to stand on. The dawn broke soft and slow over the city that had once been a prison and a battlefield, but now held the fragile hope of something new. Because after all the fights, all the challenges and broken promises, the princess stood on the highest balcony, looking out at a sky streaked with the colors of a waking sun, and the human beside her, silent, steady, breathing in sync with hers. And she thought about how far they had come from that cold hall, where chains had bound her and voices had been stolen. And how now the chains were gone, but the weight of choice was heavier than any metal. And as the city below stirred, the people waking to another day, unaware of the battles fought in shadows, or the hearts that bled in silence, she took his hand and said, do you think they will ever understand what we chose? And he smiled softly and said, maybe not, but it's not their choice. It's ours. And she looked at him and saw not just the man who had fought for her freedom, but the one who had given her the strength to fight for herself. And in that moment, the air shifted, because far beyond the stars, a signal pulsed, a warning, or perhaps a call, and the council chambers buzzed with news that an old alliance, long thought dead, was stirring. And The princess knew their fight was far from over, but this time, she would not be alone, and as the city awakened around them, she turned back inside the palace where voices echoed not in fear, but in hope, and where children played games not of war, but of heroes who dared to choose, and she said to him quietly, "We have won the battle, but the war for the future is just beginning." And he squeezed her hand and said, "Then we'll face it together." And as they stood, their two souls bound not by duty or debt, but by choice and fire and something older than stars, the first light of a new day spilled through the windows, and with it the promise that no matter what came next, they would face it side by side, and though the road ahead was uncertain, and shadow still lurked, theirs was a story not of chains but of wings, and in that endless space between hope and fear they chose to fly. If you believe humanity always finds a way, subscribe for more HFY sci-fi stories that prove it.